The Milgram Experiment, the dark side of obedience. In 1961, a young psychologist at Yale University embarked on an experiment that would forever change the way we understand human behavior, not through acts of brilliance, but through acts of darkness. His name was Stanley Milgram, and his unsettling question was deceptively simple. How far will an ordinary person go in obeying authority, even when it conflicts with their personal conscience and causes harm to another human being? The world was still reeling from the aftermath of World War II. The Nuremberg trials had exposed the horrifying reality that many of the atrocities committed during the Holocaust were executed by ordinary people claiming they were just following orders. Milgram wanted to investigate this phenomenon. Were these acts of cruelty the product of inherently evil individuals, or could anyone, under the right circumstances, commit them? The historical context. Post-war society was filled with questions about morality, authority, and human nature. Philosophers, historians, and psychologists wondered how otherwise moral individuals could participate in mass killings. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, had famously insisted he was merely obeying orders, a claim that shocked many but also prompted deeper questions about obedience and moral responsibility. Milgram's work emerged in this context. He sought a controlled, scientific way to measure the boundaries of obedience, to quantify how ordinary individuals respond to authority even when it leads to harmful actions. The setup. Participants were recruited through newspaper advertisements. They were told they were taking part in a study on learning and memory. Upon arriving at the Yale laboratory, each participant was introduced to another volunteer. In reality, this other person was an actor, carefully trained to simulate distress. A rigged lottery determined the roles. The real participant always became the teacher, and the actor became the learner. The learner was strapped into a chair in a separate room, electrodes attached to his arms, and a panel of switches labeled with voltages ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts, with the highest marked danger, severe shock. The teacher's task was simple on the surface. Read a series of word pairs aloud and administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake, increasing the voltage each time. However, the ethical complexity of the task lay in the fact that the participant believed the shocks were real and could cause real pain or even death. The deception. Of course, no actual shocks were delivered. The cries of pain were pre-recorded. But the participants did not know this. The first few shocks elicited simulated groans. By 75 volts, the learner protested. At 120 volts, he complained of severe pain. By 150 volts, he demanded to be released. At 300 volts, the learner screamed in agony and pounded on the wall. And after 330 volts, silence. Each time the teacher hesitated, the experimenter, dressed in a calm gray lab coat, would say one of 4 scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice, you must go on. The authority was calm, neutral, and unwavering. Yet, shockingly, the majority of participants obeyed. The results. Before conducting the experiment, Milgram asked experts to predict the outcome. Most believed that very few would reach the highest voltage, perhaps 1 to 2%, the so-called sadists or sociopaths. The reality was far more disturbing. 65% of participants delivered the maximum 450 volts. They obeyed despite clear signs that the learner was in extreme distress or potentially lifeless. Ordinary people, teachers, clerks, shopkeepers, housewives, all obeyed the authority figure rather than their own moral instincts. Participants displayed intense stress. Sweating, trembling, stammering, nervous laughter, and even bursts of anger or self-doubt. Yet, under the gaze of authority, they pressed the button. Reactions and moral shock. After the experiment, participants were debriefed. They were relieved to learn that no one had been harmed, but many were left deeply disturbed. Some cried, some laughed nervously, and others expressed shock at their own willingness to inflict pain. Milgram's experiment revealed something chilling. Evil doesn't always come from monsters. It can come from ordinary people who follow orders without question. He showed that obedience can override conscience when an authority figure assumes responsibility, making individuals feel morally absolved. The psychology of obedience. Milgram introduced the concept of the agentic state, a psychological condition in which individuals see themselves as agents carrying out another person's wishes, transferring responsibility for their actions to that authority. In this state, personal moral judgment is suppressed. Humans have always been fascinated and horrified by the capacity of ordinary individuals to commit acts that seem, at first glance, unimaginable. The Milgram experiment starkly revealed that situational forces often outweigh personal morality. It was not the case that participants lacked empathy. In fact, many were visibly anguished, yet they obeyed. The distress and inner conflict they experienced underscores a fundamental truth. Obedience does not erase conscience, but it can silence it temporarily under the weight of perceived authority. Consider the broader implications. In workplaces, military structures, or even online environments, individuals frequently defer to authority, often without question. Orders that seem minor or bureaucratic may, when compounded across systems, contribute to harm or injustice. The Milgram experiment serves as a reminder that the mechanisms of obedience are subtle and pervasive. They operate in everyday life, often unnoticed, shaping behaviors and decisions that ripple across society. Milgram's work also highlights the fragile nature of moral courage. It demonstrates how easily people can rationalize harmful behavior by shifting responsibility upward, a process now recognized as the agentic shift. This concept extends beyond the lab, illustrating why organizations or governments sometimes see compliant individuals participating in acts they would never consider if acting alone. Social psychologists continue to study these dynamics, emphasizing that understanding obedience is critical for fostering ethical societies. Even decades later, the lessons of the Milgram experiment resonate. Educational programs, ethics committees, and leadership training increasingly focus on the importance of questioning authority and cultivating personal responsibility. The experiment reminds us that awareness and reflection are antidotes to blind obedience, that vigilance is required to prevent the replication of harmful behaviors observed in both history and the present day. Factors influencing obedience included proximity of authority. Physical presence of the experimenter increased obedience. Distance of the victim. When the learner was unseen or distant, participants were more likely to obey. Peer influence. When other teachers defied authority, obedience dropped sharply, highlighting the power of social proof and collective courage. Expanding the lens, modern implications. Milgram's findings are not relics of history. They echo across decades and contexts. Military environments, corporate hierarchies, cults, and even digital spaces where anonymous commands can drive behavior. Modern research shows that social influence, authority, and situational pressures continue to shape actions. The experiment remains a cautionary tale. Systems of power can elicit harmful behaviors from ordinary people, often without overt coercion. The ethical debate. Milgram's methods sparked widespread controversy. Critics condemned him for deception and psychological stress imposed on participants. Was it ethical to manipulate volunteers to the point of extreme anxiety? Milgram defended his work, arguing that the experiment exposed deep truths about human nature, truths that, while uncomfortable, were necessary to understand. Ethical standards in psychological research evolved partly due to his work, introducing informed consent, debriefing, and measures to prevent harm. Historical reflections. Milgram's experiment resonates particularly in light of historical atrocities. From Eichmann and Nazi Germany to more recent cases of institutional abuse, the findings illustrate a haunting reality. Ordinary individuals can commit extraordinary harm under authoritative pressure. It raises unsettling questions. How many of us, in similar circumstances, would resist? How easily can social structures, authority figures, and institutional pressures suppress moral judgment? History has a way of echoing in the human psyche, reminding us that events of the past are never truly gone. The Milgram experiment gains additional weight when we consider the broader tapestry of historical obedience. Ordinary individuals, from bureaucrats in Nazi Germany to soldiers in distant conflicts, have repeatedly demonstrated the disturbing ease with which they can follow authority. The Holocaust, with its meticulous bureaucratic efficiency, stands as the most extreme illustration. Men and women who would never consider harming their neighbors in their daily lives found themselves administering death, signing papers, or enforcing policies under the guise of duty. Yet Milgram's findings are not constrained to the horrors of World War II. Throughout history, colonial administrators, military officers, and governmental employees have often enacted policies with devastating consequences simply because the instructions came from a higher authority. The experiment illuminates the mechanisms behind such compliance, emphasizing that it is rarely a matter of inherent malice. Rather, social conditioning, hierarchical structures, and psychological pressures often outweigh individual ethical judgment. Even in seemingly mundane historical situations, obedience has shaped outcomes with enormous implications. Consider medical personnel who, under directives, have participated in unethical experiments, or law enforcement agents who enforce discriminatory laws. Across centuries, the pattern repeats. Structures of power create situations where ordinary humans commit extraordinary acts of harm. The Milgram experiment serves as a lens through which these historical patterns can be better understood. It invites reflection on how societal norms, education systems, and institutions cultivate conformity, often at the expense of morality. By situating Milgram within the broader historical continuum, we begin to recognize that obedience is not an anomaly but a recurring feature of human societies. Awareness of these patterns is crucial. It reminds us that history does not repeat blindly. It provides lessons that must be interpreted, studied, and applied, lest similar dynamics manifest in modern contexts. The legacy of Milgram. Over 6 decades later, Milgram's work continues to be studied, debated, and dramatized. It has inspired documentaries, literature, and ethical debates, becoming a symbol of human obedience and moral conflict. It also serves as a reminder that the potential for harm exists not only in overtly violent acts but in everyday compliance, in following orders, policies, or social norms without critical reflection. The legacy of Stanley Milgram extends far beyond the laboratory walls of Yale University. His work continues to influence psychology, sociology, philosophy, and even organizational leadership, shaping the way societies understand human behavior in the face of authority. The experiment's findings are studied in universities worldwide, not only for their historical significance, but also for their relevance to contemporary ethical dilemmas. Leaders, educators, and policymakers examine the conditions that encourage blind compliance, seeking to foster environments where moral courage and critical thinking are valued over unquestioned obedience. Beyond academia, Milgram's influence permeates media, literature, and popular culture. Documentaries, films, and novels have dramatized his findings, exploring the tension between personal ethics and external pressures. These retellings underscore the universality of his message. Ordinary people possess both the capacity for cruelty and the potential for courage. They highlight the moral responsibility each individual carries, regardless of hierarchy or instruction. Importantly, Milgram's work catalyzed changes in research ethics, prompting the creation of strict guidelines to protect participants from psychological harm. Institutional review boards, informed consent protocols, and mandatory debriefing procedures are now standard practice largely because of the ethical debates his experiment ignited. These reforms serve as a lasting testament to the experiment's dual impact. It exposed human vulnerability to authority while simultaneously reinforcing the necessity of ethical oversight. Moreover, Milgram's legacy resonates in modern societal contexts. Corporate scandals, whistleblower cases, and institutional abuses often mirror the dynamics observed in his study. The tendency to defer responsibility to superiors, the rationalization of harmful acts as following orders, and the subtle pressures of group conformity all reflect the enduring relevance of his research. By examining these patterns, contemporary society can better anticipate and mitigate the risks of harmful obedience. Ultimately, Milgram's legacy is a cautionary tale as much as it is a beacon of understanding. It challenges us to interrogate authority, nurture critical reflection, and cultivate empathy in the face of hierarchical pressures. His work reminds us that awareness, education, and vigilance are essential tools for preventing the repetition of history's darkest chapters. The echo of his experiment persists, urging humanity to balance obedience with conscience, power with morality, and authority with accountability. Final reflections. The Milgram experiment forces us to confront a disquieting truth. The line between good and evil is thinner than we like to imagine. It challenges us to question authority, examine our own moral compass, and recognize the influence of situational pressure. Evil is not always monstrous or visible. It can be subtle, polite, and professional, and it can reside in all of us, waiting for circumstances that diminish personal responsibility. Stanley Milgram didn't just study obedience. He held up a mirror to humanity, revealing the dark potential that exists in ordinary people. Once we see it, we cannot unsee it, and perhaps the first step toward a more moral society is simply acknowledging the uncomfortable truth of our own capacity for compliance.